Welcome to Burns Banter, the podcast that takes a fresh look at the life and works of Robert Burns, hosted by myself, Alistair Turnbull. Now, I must apologise because I haven't put a podcast out for a couple of weeks. There's two reasons for this. One, I was on holiday with my wife and we toured round about England in my camper van. And the other thing is, I am getting ready for my show at the Edinburgh Festival. I'm taking Burns Banter and doing a live version of it at the Edinburgh Festival this year. It's happening from the 16th to the 25th of August. It's 10:30 till 11:30 in the morning at the Attic in a place called the Counting House. And I'd love to see you there. So if you're in Edinburgh for the festival this year, please come along and see me. Having said that, the last episode we did with Robert, he was a slightly better fortune. He was having a slightly better time. He had thought about going to Jamaica, but he produced his book, the Kilmarnock edition. It got a very good reception, and he changed his mind. He decided to go to Edinburgh to produce a second edition. So in this episode, I'm going to tell you how he got to Edinburgh. I'm going to tell you some of the people and some of the things he did when he was in Edinburgh during the day, the polite side of things. I'm going to tell you about some of the convivial clubs that he joined, and I'll explain more about them. They were more of an evening thing. I'll tell you about the Edinburgh edition itself, the book, what was in it, when it was published, that kind of thing. I'm going to recite a poem to you, which was one of the few poems that he wrote when he was there. It's called An Address to Edinburgh. And then we'll do a wee roundup. So let's dive straight in and find out how Robert made it to Edinburgh. Right, Robert's decided to go to Edinburgh to produce a second edition of his poems. Now, he's got a little bit of money from the book from the first edition, but he's never travelled much beyond Ayr before, doesn't really know much beyond the boundaries, doesn't quite know how to get to Edinburgh, or the way he's going to do it anyway. So he ends up by going to a friend of his called George Reid, who was a farmer. He had a farm called Barqueary, which was near Ochiltree, and George Reid said to him, you can borrow a pony from me. So Robert Burns borrowed a pony, which I believe is quite an old pony, and he headed out towards Edinburgh. He rode to Edinburgh. Now, it's about 60 miles away, Edinburgh, so he couldn't do it in the one day. He'd have to stop over somewhere. And his friend George Reid said again, no problem at all. You should head to a farm called Covington Mains, which is just outside of Biggar. Now, George had a friend there as well who owned the farm, and he sent word ahead saying that Robert was going to stay over the night with them on his way to Edinburgh. Now, what Robert didn't know was he'd also invited all the farmers in the area to meet him, right? It was meant to be a big thing. So Robert was heading on his pony. He actually left on the... When did he leave? It was the 27th of November, 1786. 27th of November. It was a Monday. Honestly, it was a Monday. And he headed for the first time out of his native Ayrshire to this other farm called Covington Mains, near Biggar. When he got there, they had already arranged a big celebration for him being there. And there was a signal and everything waiting. They had somebody looking out for Robert coming on the pony. And as soon as they saw him, they got a white sheet, put it on a pitchfork and put it in the barnyard. And it was like a big white sail. As soon as the farmers saw that big white sail, they knew that Burns was coming. And they welcomed him with open arms, brought him into their house, you know. They had a very good evening together. They ate together, they drank together. And one account of it, they said that they borrowed heavily from the next day, which means they went drinking till the early hours of the next morning. And then Robert got back on his pony the next day, rode the other 30 miles into Edinburgh, but he was not in a good way. He had really enjoyed that night with the farmers. So Burns arrived 2 days later with a bad hangover and an old pony in Edinburgh. And he got it stabled and then looked for somewhere to stay. And I'll tell you about where he stayed next. Right, Robert's in Edinburgh. He's made it. He's got a hangover, but he's here. He ended up staying with a friend of his called John Richmond. Now, John Richmond he'd rented a room in a place called Baxter Close. Baxter Close is at the top of the Royal Mile, just beside Edinburgh Castle, really, just off the Lawn Market. And he was like at the first or second floor, I'm not entirely sure, but it was a very small room he had, but Robert shared it with him and stayed with him for a while. Robert then set about trying to put things in motion for his second edition. Now, he did that by speaking to a guy called William Creech. Now, William Creech was like the leading Edinburgh publisher of his day, but he didn't actually publish anything. He was just a sort of literary agent. So Robert got in contact with him through acquaintances and through the fact he was doing very well with his book. Creech was interested to do a second book because he knew he could make money on it. And he met with Robert and he agreed to be Robert's agent. So William Creech is now Robert's literary agent in Edinburgh. And Creech immediately signed up for 500 copies of the new edition. Now, he did this because he was going to buy them cheaply and sell them at a profit. It's all about money with William Creech. But he said to Robert, yes, I'll be your Edinburgh agent, but you have to find a printer and binder yourself to actually produce the book. So Robert asked about, and he eventually settled on a guy called William Smellie to publish his book. William Smellie had a printer's composing room in a place called Anchor's Close. And he was a well-known printer as well. He'd printed for guys such as Robert Ferguson, a poet that was well-known before Robert Burns. He'd also published stuff for Adam Smith. He was a big name in the Scottish Enlightenment. I mean, he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, which is still quoted today. So this guy, William Smellie, is a well-known printer and binder. And he's agreed to print and bind the book for Robert Burns, and William Creech is now going to be his agent. So Burns is in Edinburgh. He's staying with his friend. Things are in motion for the book, so things have started. That's good. What does he do during the day? What does he get up to? Let's have a look at that next. Right, let's have a look at what Robert does with a lot of his time in Edinburgh, during the day anyway. He spends a lot of it with William Smellie in the printing room in Anchor Close. He looks over the print, makes sure it's okay that's going to go into his book. He's also well known for reading other people's print when he was in there as well, to see what's happening, what other authors were doing. And during his time in Edinburgh, I mean, remember Robert was a farmer. He'd had a lot of hardship in his life. He didn't have a lot of grandeur or splendour or anything like that. He was also just a poor farmer. And now he's been catapulted into Edinburgh society. Because of his book, the Kilmarnock edition, it's produced real interest in his work. People can't believe that this poet farmer has written this. So they want him to be at their dinner parties. You're nobody in Edinburgh that season if you don't have Robert Burns as your dinner guest, And this is the time in Burns's life that we all talk about. This is the really good times that we talk about him going out drinking and having a good time and meeting with all the great and good of Scotland. This is that period in his life. But it didn't last that long. He was only in Edinburgh for about 5 or 6 months, and that was the height of his fame. So let's have a look at some of the people he met when he was here, some of the things he did. Well, he met with Dougal Stewart, was a friend of his. He then got introduced to people such as Hugh Blair, who was the Minister of St Giles. He met a guy called Henry Mackenzie, who was the author of a book called The Man of Feeling. Burns couldn't believe he met this guy. He'd read the book, The Man of Feeling, and he was in awe of this author. He met with a woman called the Duchess of Gordon, who was married for 20 years to the Duke of Gordon, and she'd given him 7 children, but she was a bit of a wild child. She spent, apart from giving him 7 children, that never did anything to stop her from being a socialite. She spent all her time dancing, playing cards, and in company. She was a bit crazy. She actually got, I mean, the louder the party, the more outrageous it was. She was always there, a real socialite. She once got in trouble for riding down the high street in the back of a pig. That's the kind of person she was. But she was really high up in the social stratosphere. She actually talked about, she met Robert and found him wildly interesting. She met Sir Walter Scott and told Sir Walter Scott this a couple of years later about Robert. She said, "I'd never met a man whose conversation so completely carried me off my feet." So Robert knew how to talk to women and was good at parties. There's a shocker. There's a shocker right there. He met a guy called the Earl of Glencairn. Now, he was very influential in Edinburgh, very influential. The Earl of Glencairn had been the Scottish representative in the House of Lords or the House of Peers or whatever it is. He was a Scottish peer in the House of Lords in London for 4 years. Highly influential. He also was a member of the Caledonian Hunt, which was a big organisation in Edinburgh at the time. And he got all the people in the Caledonian Hunt to subscribe to the new book. Now, they didn't do an awful lot of hunting in the Caledonian Hunt. It was more drinking and dancing and the occasional sports. But he got them to sign up for all these books. Now, Robert's a Mason. He does a lot of Masonic stuff in Edinburgh. I'm sorry, I'm not a Mason. I don't know exactly what he did. But he did go to a lot of Masonic lodges. And one in particular he went to was the Lodge of St Andrews, which is on George Street in Edinburgh. It's a big, important Masonic lodge. And at that meeting, something happened. The Grand Master, I don't know the terminology, the guy in charge, my apologies to Masons out there, I don't know the terminology, but he proclaimed Robert to be Caledonia's Bard. This great honour was bestowed upon him at a meeting in Lodge, St Andrews Lodge. Robert didn't know that was going to happen. He actually wrote this down a while later about that actual thing. He said, "As I had no idea such a thing would happen, I was downright thunderstruck, and trembling in every nerve, made the best reply in my power." So, yeah, I mean, he was introduced to the great and good of Edinburgh society. Basically, he had to do that because he wanted to raise subscribers for his new book. And he just wanted to meet these people. If he had influential friends, it would help him. I don't know if you remember from the previous episodes, but Gene Armour's father had a writ out against him, an arrest warrant. He was getting less and less concerned about that because he had more and more influential friends. And they would help him with that. So that was another thing that was happening. I'll tell you one other person he met as well. It was, if I can find my notes on it. Yeah, a lot of these things happened in the afternoon. You were invited to someone's house, a person of note. And one afternoon, Dougal Stewart invited him along to a guy called Dr. Adam Ferguson's house. Adam Ferguson was well known for having intellectual soirees in the afternoon, and he held the chair of moral philosophy before Dougal Stewart did. And Robert went along to this house and he was having tea in the afternoon. There was lots of people there and stuff. And at one point he saw on the wall a picture. And underneath the picture was these words: "Cold on Canadian hills and Minden's plains, perhaps that parent wept her soldier slain. Bent over her babe, her eye dissolved in dew, the big drops mingling with the milk he drew." Now, Robert read those words out and he got quite emotional about it. And he said to the people in the room, "Who wrote that? I mean, that's beautiful. Who wrote it?" And none of the adults in the room or any of the businessmen or any of them could tell him anything about it. But a young boy, a young sort of 16-year-old boy with a limp, he did have a limp, he walked over to him and said, "I believe it was written by Langhorne, and it's in a poem called Justice of Peace." Now, Robert was very impressed that the young boy knew that, and he said to the guy, "You'll be a man yet, sir." That young boy was Walter Scott, who turned out to be Sir Walter Scott. That was the first and possibly one of the only or the few times he met Walter Scott in his lifetime. But it made an impression on Walter Scott because later on Walter Scott wrote he thought about it and wrote down his impression of Robert. And this was his impression. He said, it was Burns' strong expression of sense and shrewdness that came to mind. The eye alone, I think, indicated the poetical character and temperament. It was large and of a dark cast, which glowed. I say literally glowed when he spoke with feeling or interest. I never saw such another eye in a human head, though I've seen the most distinguished men of my time. So he's meeting a lot of people. There is lots more stuff I could tell you. I could go on for hours, but you're probably getting bored about this now. We'll leave the polite side of society and we'll look at what he did at night time. More interesting stuff coming up. Right, Edinburgh at night. Now, Edinburgh had two kind of sides to its personality. It had a very polite side during the day and a more rough and ready side at night. And at the time, there was a lot of clubs starting. They were called convivial clubs. They were basically just drinking clubs, and they all had various names. I mean, there were clubs like the Skull, the Blast, Quaff, the Whinbush, the Humdrum. I mean, there was a club called the Dirty Club, and nobody was allowed into that club when they were wearing clean clothes. It was just a bit weird. They had a club called the Odd Fellows, where whenever you were in, you had to sign your name upside down and do various other things that were a bit weird. There was a club called the Boar Club. The sort of wilder guys that were in that one, they called themselves pigs, and they called the room they met in a sty, and they got up to some pretty debaucherous stuff. All these clubs are actually like the sort of forerunner to the modern clubs like the Rotary Club, or the clubs you see in North America, the sort of, clubs of men that get together, various names from there. Robert joined a club called the Crocklin Fencibles. Now, he was probably introduced to the Crocklin Fencibles by William Smellie, his printer and binder, because his printing and binding shop was in Anchor Close, and the Crocklin Fencibles used to meet in a pub in Anchor Close. What was it called again? I can't remember the name of the pub, but it was owned by a guy called Daniel or Donnie Douglas. And he used to sing a song when the spirit moved him, called the Croton Clane, which is my very bad Gaelic for Collins cattle. So Crocklin. And the Fencibles was a thing. It was... At the time, they had sort of homegrown regiments of soldiers in case of invasion and stuff like that, and they were called the Fencibles. And the Crocklin Fencibles was a sort of, a bit of a piss take really on that. The members of the club took mock ranks like captain, colonel, major, and they basically just drank together, and they tried to outwit each other in conversation, a bit like trying to roast each other all the time. Like they would try and get the better of their peers by slagging them, and they had to make their own way back in conversation and stuff like that. And in the initiation, the person that's getting initiated to the club has to give as good as they get. Now, Robert actually said when he was initiated, he said he had never been so abominably thrashed in his life. They really took the piss out of him, basically. But a week or so later, he was given as good as he got. He got into the way of things, and he really enjoyed them. Again, they used to drink together. There was a lot of people in there. People who weren't so wealthy, people who were really wealthy, they were all in that club together. And they wrote together a book called The Merry Muses of Caledonia. Now, Robert wrote a lot of poems for that. They were only for private use, right? It has since been published, but it was mainly guys getting together and telling dirty jokes and singing dirty songs, and they would call it bawdy poetry, B-A-W-D-Y, bawdy poetry, which is just rude poetry. And he wrote a lot about that, and it was all in there. And it was The Merry Muses of Caledonia. When it was published, on the first page it said for the use by the members of the Crocklin Fencibles. But so he spent a lot of his time drinking, having a good time there. He met a lot of people in there that were really quite influential in what he did. He met a guy called William Nicol. Now, we're going to talk about him in next week's episode, but he was a Latin scholar and a high school professor, taught children and stuff like that. He actually taught Sir Walter Scott, and he also taught Lord Cockburn. He wasn't a particularly good teacher. He said, Walter Scott said about William Nicol, he was an excellent classical scholar, an admirable convivial humourist, but worthless, drunken, and inhumanely cruel to the boys under his charge. Anyway, we'll leave him there. He's going to be in next week's episode. But Robert also met other guys like William Dunbar, who was quite high up in the law aspects of Edinburgh at the time, and he had the rank of colonel in the Crockland Fencibles. And you may know the song Rattlin' Roarin' Willie. That's a song by Robert Burns. That's actually written about William Dunbar, one of the guys in the Crockland Fencibles. So Robert did do a lot of drinking in these clubs. And because he was spending his time doing this, he wasn't really writing any poetry. I mean, he only produced 2 things of note and all the time he was in Edinburgh. Now, one of them was addressed to a haggis, and I pretty much think he wrote most of that when he was in Mauchline. I think he added the last verse or something in when he was at his friend, I think it was Andrew Buckley, his house, when he said addressed the haggis for the first time in Edinburgh. And then the other thing he wrote was addressed to Edinburgh. That's the only thing of note really he wrote when he was in Edinburgh, basically because he was having too much of a good time. He just kept on enjoying himself, meeting people, getting interested in his next book, and he took it from there. The poem I'm going to recite later on is addressed to Edinburgh. But before we do that, let's look at the actual book that he produced, which was called the Edinburgh edition, his second edition of poems. Okay, the Edinburgh edition. This was the whole reason that Robert went to Edinburgh in the first place. He was there to produce a second volume of his poems, a bigger and better edition of poems. And he did that. It was called the Edinburgh edition, and it became available on the 17th of April, 1787. Now, the book itself, let's compare it to the Kilmarnock edition. This book had 343 pages of poems against the 235 that were in the original Kilmarnock edition. And the Kilmarnock edition only had 5 pages of a glossary. This has got 24 pages of a glossary. Now, in this edition, there was 22 extra poems put in there, such as The Briggs of Ayr, Death and Dr. Hornbrook, The Calf, and also a song called Green Grow the Rashes O, which we still sing today. So this was the edition that was produced when he was there. And there was thousands of this issue sold, thousands. Now, on the day that it came out, he had a meeting with his friend called Henry Mackenzie. And he went to Henry Mackenzie's house to meet with William Creech, his literary agent. So the book came out. They knew it was going to do well because well over 1,000 people had subscribed to it. So 1,000 copies were going out the door straight away. Now, William Creech wanted to make more money on this. He had in his mind that he wanted to produce copies for London and produce copies for people in America. So he went to Robert and he said, on the same day it came out, he said, you're going to make a bit of money off this book. It's going to be okay. It's going to be good. But what you should do is, nobody's going to buy it after a while in Scotland because there's so many copies out there. You should sell the rights to all of your poems to me. You should sell the rights to everything you've written to me, and I'll give you 100 guineas. 100 guineas. Now, Robert, being the excellent businessman that he is, jumped at that offer and said, that's great, William. You give me the 100 guineas, you can have the rights to every single one of my poems. And that's what happened. On the 17th of April 1787, the same day as the Edinburgh edition came out, he sold the rights to his poems to William Creech. 100 guineas, by the way, in today's money is about £30,000 to £35,000. So it meant he was going to get a bit of money in his hands, which is great. And But anything that was published after that with his poems, he would earn nothing from. Absolutely nothing. So the book has come out. He has sold the rights to his poems. He has the promise of 100 guineas from William Creech. He hasn't got the money in his hand yet. And he's feeling quite good about himself. Let's leave that there for a second, and I'll recite the poem Address to Edinburgh. Address to Edinburgh. Now, this poem was actually written in a different kind of style than Robert usually writes. He wrote it in an English style called Augustan verse. Robert usually writes with a happy stanza, which is a more Scottish thing. But he wrote an Augustan verse to appeal to the people of Edinburgh. And the poem is quite flowery, and it's really just a sort of fluff piece, to introduce himself to Edinburgh, to get more subscribers for his book. He's been very complimentary. But I'll explain a couple of things about it before I actually read it. He uses the word Edina. Edina is just another word for Edinburgh. Okay, every time he says Edina, he means Edinburgh. In one of the verses, he talks about the daughters of Edinburgh, and he mentions Fair Burnet. Fair Burnet actually refers to a woman called Eliza Burnet, who was the youngest daughter of the philosopher Lord Monboddo. And Eliza Burnet at the time was meant to be the most popular woman in Edinburgh. I don't know why, but she's said to be the most popular woman in Edinburgh. So that's Fair Burnet. He talks about, at one point, the scarred walls hanging above the rugged rock. That's Edinburgh Castle he's talking about. Edinburgh Castle sits in the middle of Edinburgh on a volcanic plug, a big rocky volcanic plug. But I mean, and he also talks about the lack of power in Edinburgh because they'd recently lost the government. The government had basically been sold to England after a disastrous project called the Darien Project. Basically, the wealthy people of Edinburgh sold it away. So he talks about the lack of kings and sovereign and all the rest of it. And that's what he means by that. So let me read the poem and see what you think. Address to Edinburgh, 1787. Edina, Scotia's darling seat, all hail thy palaces and towers, where once beneath a monarch's feet sat legislation's sovereign powers. From marking wildly scattered flowers, as on the banks of Ayr I strayed, and singing lone the lingering hours, I shelter in thy honoured shade. Here wealth still swells the golden tide, as busy trade his labours piles. Their architecture's noble pride bids elegance and splendour rise. Here justice from her native skies high wields her balance and her rod. Their learning with his eagle eyes seeks science in her coy abode. The sons, Edina, social kind, with open arms the stranger hail. Their views enlarged, their liberal mind, above the narrow rural vale. Attentive still to sorrow's swale, our modest merit silent claim, and never may their sources fail, and never envy blot their name. The daughters, bright thy walls adorn, gay as the gilded summer sky, sweet as the dewy milk-white thorn, dear as the raptured thrill of joy. Fair Burnet strikes the adoring eye, heaven's beauties on my fancy shine. I see the sire of love on high, and own his work indeed divine. Their watching high, the least alarms, thy rough, rude fortress gleams afar, like some bold veteran grey in arms, and marked with many a seamy scar. The ponderous wall and massy bar, grim rising over the rugged rock, have oft withstood assailing war, and oft repelled the invader's shock. With awestruck thought and pitying tears, I view that noble stately dome, where Scotia's kings of other years, famed heroes, had their royal home. Alas, how changed the times to come! Their royal name is low in dust. Their hapless race wild wandering roam, through rigid law cries out, "'Twas just." Wild beats my heart to trace your steps, whose ancestors in days of yore, through hostile ranks and ruined gaps, old Scotia's bloody lion bore. Even I, who sing in rustic love, haply my sires have left their shed, and fancied grim danger's loudest roar, bold following where your fathers led. Edina, Scotia's darling seat, all hail thy palaces and towers, where once beneath a monarch's feet sat legislation's sovereign powers. From marking wildly scattered flowers, as on the banks of Ayr I strayed, and singing lone the lingering hours, I shelter in thy honoured shade. Basically introducing himself to Edinburgh, talking about the men in Edinburgh, the women in Edinburgh, the castle. He's mourning the fact that they have no legislation rights anymore because they've been signed away. But other than that, a bit of a fluff piece to introduce himself to the people there. And as I said, one of the very few things of note he wrote when he was in Edinburgh at the time. Okay, so let's have a recap of what's happened in this episode. Robert has gone to Edinburgh. He's been introduced to the great and the good of society. He's produced his second book of poems, the Edinburgh edition. And he's now kind of wondering what to do after that. Again, this is a period of his life that people talk about with Robert Burns. The good times, the making money, the getting the poems out there, the meeting the great and the good. But it only lasted for about 5 or 6 months. He got a bit fed up with it. And after he published his second book, which was the Edinburgh edition, and he decided to leave Edinburgh and go somewhere else, more of that in the next episode, this was really Robert at the height of his poetic powers. After he left Edinburgh, which he does, and I'll tell you about that in the next episode, that's really effectively Robert's poetical life over. He shone brightly in that time, but moved on to other things. Now, I'm not saying he didn't write any more poetry. He did, but not very much. Some of it very good, but not very much of it. He moves on to a period in his life where he's not really a poet. He goes into being a songwriter and a collector of songs. But more about that in next week's episode. So I hope you've enjoyed this one. I hope to see you possibly at Edinburgh, at the Edinburgh Festival. And more than that, I hope to see you in next week's episode of Burns Banter. But until then, Slán Java.